Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Welcome, everybody. This is our second installment of the Land to Lots podcast. My name is Carter Froelich, and I'm the managing principal of Launch Development Finance Advisors. And for those of you who may not be familiar with Launch is a transaction-based real estate consulting firm. We focus strictly on working with private sector clients to help them finance public infrastructure, reduce infrastructure costs, and mitigate their risk, all with the goal of enhancing project profitability. If you want to get a little refresher on special purpose taxing districts, I encourage you to go back to podcast number 1 and listen to that podcast describing more of an overview on special purpose taxing districts. And also there's information in the show notes that you may be interested in. In today's podcast, what I'd like to discuss are what are the 10 most common questions that we get from clients when we're talking to them about the opportunity of financing infrastructure through special purpose taxing districts. The first question, and by far the most common question, is what can I finance? The answer to that is, no matter what state we're working in, is typically any infrastructure that is going to be owned and operated by a public entity. So the key word in this is public. It's got to be owned by a city, a county, a town, or a quasi-political subdivision. The infrastructure that's typically included under these categories are public roads, public water, public sewer, public storm drain, public parks, libraries, schools in some states, fire stations, police stations, traffic lights, street lights, basically any type of infrastructure that you would need to build a community. As long as it's public, you can finance. The next kind of subset of that is we have a number of clients that have to build public infrastructure, but then they also, for instance, may have a private guard-gated community. So they ask us, well, how is the guard gate going to impact my ability to finance infrastructure through the special purpose taxing district? And say, for instance, we have a public roadway that goes off an arterial roadway into a master plan community that's a private guard-gated community. Typically what we could do is finance the roadway to the guard gate, and then on the other side of the guard gate that is private, we would not be able to finance the bonds or through bonds that private roadway. If, for instance, in the same example, we have public water and sewer lines that are running from the arterial road into the private guard-gated community, we would be able to finance the water and sewer facilities both from the arterial roadway into the guard gate and then into the community itself, because those water and sewer lines are owned and operated by, in this example, the city, so that even though they're under a private road, we would be able to finance them through the district. And I'm going to use the term district as kind of a catch-all for all the different districts that are available around the United States. There are some other kind of really cool nuances that we can do with infrastructure financing depending upon what state we're in and what the specific statutes allow. One of those centers around the financing of amenity centers and using public debt to do that. It's kind of the background on the financing of public infrastructure. The concept is that if we're using public dollars to finance public infrastructure, the public has to be able to use it. So in the case of a roadway, that's pretty simple, where it's a public roadway, anybody can drive on it. When we're talking about amenity centers that may be constructed primarily for servicing the residents within a master plan community, it gets a little nuanced, because if we're going to be financing that through public debt, the public has to be able to access that amenity center. And the issue that we typically have with developers is that they don't necessarily want the public in their amenity centers. They want their amenity centers to be used exclusively by the residents. So one of the ways that developers get around this, and is fairly common, is to, if we are in fact financing the amenity center through special district bond proceeds, is to have the district own and operate that amenity center. And that amenity center is open to all of the residents, and because they're able to demonstrate that they're residents and they're paying their HOA or a district amenity fee, they're able to use that facility without any problems. Now, if a individual from outside of the community comes in and wants to utilize that facility, they have to be allowed to use that facility. However, we're able to charge them a daily usage fee, which may be $25, $30, $50 per day for them to use the facility. That's perfectly legal. And as a result of that, you typically don't get public outside of the boundaries of the district or the master plan coming in to use those facilities. So it's a means by which we can actually finance infrastructure which typically wasn't financed, that being the amenity center, through public bonds. So something to keep in mind. We've got some other tricks up our sleeve too related to that, but as it relates to the first question, what can I finance? Think public. Anything that is going to be owned and operated by the public is infrastructure that I can finance. Some of the state statutes allow us to finance private infrastructure, meaning cable, gas, electrical, but there are limitations placed upon that. And generally, we have way more costs and we have bonding capacity. So typically we go after the easy infrastructure, which is the streets, roads, water, storm drain, first before we get into some of these other interest categories. The other thing that I'd like to kind of throw out as well as it relates to the category of other infrastructure that you can finance is we can also buy real property interests. And to the extent that we write the terms of eligible infrastructure in our financing agreements, we can also get repaid financing costs as well. So even though financing costs isn't typically indicated in a lot of state statutes, it is something that we are able to finance as a matter of fact. Moving on to question number 2. Is how much can I borrow? And that really depends. And everything is based, for the most part, on what type of bonds we're going to be issuing. And more importantly, what is our tax rate vis-a-vis the competition's tax rate? The most important concept that I want to try to get across to everybody, and under the heading of how much can I borrow, is we do not want to increase our project's property tax rate to a level where we make our project uncompetitive with the surrounding marketplace. So what we'll do is sit down with you. We will look at your tax bills. We will get a list of competitive communities that you anticipate your project to be competing against. Typically, because we're working in states that have and use these types of financing mechanisms, as a matter of fact, most of the competitive projects will have some sort of district associated with them. So we will go look at what the competitive arena has in terms of their total effective tax rate. So say, for instance, and I'll use the state of Arizona as an example, but if we have a master plan community and they have a tax rate that shows up as $12 per $100 of assessed value, and our competition, as we have gone out and surveyed their property tax rate, let's just call it, their tax rate is $16 per 100 of assessed valuation. We have the ability to take our tax rate and raise it from whether we're using ad valorem based taxes or whether we're using an equivalent special assessment lien. We're able to take our effective tax rate from $12 up to $16 and theoretically not impact our ability to compete against the competitive arena, because now we have a competitive tax rate, meaning our tax rate has now been risen from $12 to $16, and the competition is at $16. So what does that mean? It just means that we have the same tax rate whether you're in our project or whether you're looking at a competitive property. And what we have found in our experience is that people typically don't beat a path to our door because we have a lower property tax rate, especially when we're talking about residential development. Most home buyers, they're not familiar with property taxes. They don't understand them. They understand that it's something they're going to have to pay, but they don't really compare tax rate in your community against somebody else's master plan community. Now, the one exception of that is California, where most of the home buyers are pretty savvy. But in most other places in the country, somebody falls in love with a community because of its location, its ingress, its egress, its amenities, its location to work environments, because of a school district. They don't necessarily decide to buy in a community because of the tax rate. So as long as we are within a competitive margin of the competition, we have found that whether our tax rate is slightly higher than the competition or slightly lower, it really doesn't make any difference in terms of absorption, because people are going to be purchasing that home for a lot of other reasons, and typically that reason doesn't involve property taxes. So as it relates to how much can I borrow, once we determine what the competitive market is, and once we determine how high we can increase property taxes, we can then take that additional revenue that'll be generated and put it into our bond models to be able to come back to you as the developer and say, hey, if we increase our tax rate by 60 cents or $1.50, or if we levy a $20,000 assessment, here's where our tax rate is going to be vis-a-vis the competition. And at the end of the day, after we issue the bonds, pay the underwriters, pay the cost of issuance, have a capitalized interest, and to the extent that we have a reserve fund, fund the reserve fund, here's how much will be available for you to construct or acquire public infrastructure related to your project. So as it relates to how much can I borrow, it really depends on your property tax rate, or I should say your project's property tax rate compared to that of the competition. In some instances, we'll actually go higher than the competition if we feel in discussions with our client that we've got a better mousetrap, meaning we've got the last piece of property that's on a lake. There will be no other property on the lake. And so in those instances, to the extent that we feel that we have a better, more compelling argument to have people come to our property to enjoy the amenities, in this case a lake that nobody else has, we may want to go slightly higher, provided that we have additional costs that we need to fund through a higher tax rate. So, moving on to question number 3, what kind of bond should I issue? And the answer to that question is it's going to depend on what state we're in. So, for instance, there are 3 different bond types that we typically see with special purpose taxing districts. Actually 4. One is a general obligation bond. The second is a special assessment bond. The third is a revenue bond. And then the fourth, which is specific to California, is a special tax levy bond. So let's talk first about the GO bond. A GO bond is a bond that is secured by an increase in the ad valorem property tax of property contained within the boundaries of a district. So to go back to my previous example, assume we have an Arizona project and our tax rate is currently $12 per 100 of assessed value, and we wanted to increase it to $16, then we would levy a $4 ad valorem property tax over all of the property contained within the boundaries of the district. So when the Mr. and Mrs. Homebuyer get their tax bill, it would show in this example, here's the regular property tax, $12. Here is the additional property tax from the Arizona Community Facilities District number 1, $4, total tax rate, $16. The thing about general obligation bonds that you need to be aware of is that general obligation bonds are sized based upon the assessed valuation of the property. So when we're looking at assessed valuation of property, be it in Arizona or Texas or Utah, wherever the property may be, even though the property may have a very high fair market value, when the county assessor or appraisal district appraises or assesses that property, it has a very low assessed valuation. So in other words, if we're levying $4 against assessed valuation of raw land, the amount of revenue, because the assessed valuation is so low, that we're going to be generating is minimal. We're not going to be able to issue a lot of bonds off of that. So what has to happen is that the developer has to put in the infrastructure. They have to sell the lots to the home builder. The home builder has to build the home, and we have to get that home on the tax rolls before we're able to start to generate any type of revenue to be able to repay the developer for all of the big upfront costs that they have funded to launch, no pun intended, the project. So as it relates to GO bonds, think of those as more of a reimbursement mechanism, meaning we're going to have to put a lot of infrastructure in the ground, and we're going to have to sell pads, sell lots to builders. They're going to have to build a house, and then we're going to have to get that house on the tax bill before we're able to generate any money. So the states that use general obligation bonds primarily, you'll see the MUDs in Texas, the Arizona Community Facilities Districts, the metro districts in Colorado, although they have a little different taxing structure that allows us to issue bonds up front and based on the anticipated value that will be coming with homes, so we're able to get that money sooner. But Colorado is the exception rather than the rule. The next bond type is a special assessment bond. A special assessment bond is a bond that is secured by a specific lien on a specific piece of property. So the best way to think about this is, let's assume that we're going to be developing phase one of a two-phase project. We're issuing phase one's special assessment bond up front. We're going to use bond proceeds to construct public infrastructure that is specifically benefiting phase one. So in this example, let's assume we're building water, sewer, and roads that's going to be fronting each lot. What happens is the bonds are issued, we put in the streets, roads, water, and sewer, and then the bond amount is divvied up on a per lot basis. I mean, literally the bond amount is divided by the number of lots that we've just liened, and an individual lien is placed on each one of those lots. The lien is a specific lien on that specific piece of property. If I, as a home buyer, want to pay off my lien, and let's just call it in this example a $15,000 lien, I'm able to go and write a check and pay off my $15,000 lien so that I am no longer paying, as part of my property taxes, an annual assessment related to the repayment of my $15,000 lien. The assessment bonds are sized based upon the fair market value of the land, assuming that the infrastructure to be financed and or any other infrastructure for which the developer has obtained a performance bond is in place as of the date of valuation. And typically, the industry standard for the bond world is that they will, meaning the bond buyers, are happy to lend 33% or a 3-to-1 value to lien ratio against that appraised fair market value. So, what does that mean? If, for instance, we assume that we have a $90,000 finished lot once we fund our improvements and or construct the improvements for which we have completion guarantees, we would be able to get a third of that amount, or $30,000 per lot, as an assessment for us to build infrastructure. So the beauty of the assessment bonds is it's a way for us to be able to accelerate cash into the pro forma or use bond proceeds to actually build infrastructure that is benefiting that particular phase. And because we're using bond proceeds, we're able to reduce the amount of equity we're having to borrow, or we're able to decrease the amount of additional third-party debt that we're having to obtain, thereby reducing the overall project borrowing costs. Now, there's a lot of really cool things that you can do with assessment bonds. And some of the things we do is that you can literally do multiple bond issuances and lay them on top of one another. So what does that mean? Let's assume, for instance, that we've determined that the market will allow a $20,000 per lot special assessment on each one of our lots. Because, however, the value of our land is so high, we could actually go out and lien each lot up to $35,000 a lot. Okay, so the value of the property allows us $35,000 a lot. Market, however, meaning the home buyers are only willing to probably accept $20,000. But given the fact that we have a lot of infrastructure we need to construct to get the project off the ground, we determined that we're going to be issuing a $35,000 per lot bond, and we're going to be using those construction proceeds to construct infrastructure benefiting those lots. When we get to a revenue event, in this case, we're going to sell that lot to a home buyer, and because we know the home buyer is only willing to accept $20,000, we can, as part of closing that transaction to the home buyer, pay off $15,000 of that $35,000 assessment, thereby only passing on $20,000 to the home buyer. So what we were able to do is to tap into long-term tax-exempt non-recourse bond financing, build infrastructure out of bond proceeds, and then when we had a revenue event, we're able to take some of that revenue, pay down the assessment, and pass on what the market is willing to accept. We don't have the ability to do that with general obligation bonds, because that general obligation bond covers all of the land contained within the boundaries of the district based upon its assessed valuation, and there's no way for us to pick out one lot and say we're going to pay down the ad valorem tax rate on that particular lot. So one of the things to remember in terms of assessment bonds, there's a lot of really neat things that we can do. Second of all, because we're issuing the debt based on the fair market value of the property as opposed to the assessed value. In the case of a GO bond, we're able to get that money sooner rather than later and actually use it to build out of bond proceeds. Third bond type is a revenue bond. We really don't see revenue bonds used that much in big master plan communities because typically we don't have a revenue source. And revenue bonds are secured by a revenue stream to be generated typically by a project and or an asset. The easiest way to think in terms of revenue bonds might be a parking garage, meaning we're going to issue a revenue bond and we're going to build a parking garage within an existing mixed-use community, for instance. The bonds that are securing or that built the parking garage are secured by the daily and or monthly parking revenues that parking garage generates. And because oftentimes in master plan communities we don't have, parking garages per se, there's not a lot of revenue generating infrastructure items. Now, with that having been said, we are setting up districts. We have set up districts, for instance, where we're collecting tap fees, hookup fees, and or what we're calling monthly infrastructure surcharges as part of a water and sewer bond issuance. And we're using those revenue streams to monetize and issue revenue bonds. The other places where you see this done quite often is in Florida, where they may take an amenity fee that's being charged by a master plan developer for the residents to be able to use amenities that are owned by the special district, and they are monetizing those revenue streams and issuing revenue bonds. Those revenue bonds are used to fund the community amenities, the amenity center, the parks, the softball fields, the lakes, those kind of things. So it is a bond that we should consider, provided that our state enabling legislation allows us to use it. It's more of a kind of a secondary backup. We don't see it used a lot. However, it is a potential financing mechanism that we could utilize to finance infrastructure. The second or the last bond is really related to California and their community facilities districts. It's called a special tax levy. And in this instance, it's kind of a combination of a general obligation bond and an assessment bond, but it's a special tax that is assigned to different property categories. Typically in California, we try not to push up total property taxes as a percentage of home price above 2%. And say, for instance, when we take a look at an existing property that has a 1% ad valorem statutory tax rate, and then other special taxing districts that move up our total percentage of our total property tax rate to 1.5% of home price, we may then levy a special tax levy that moves at of 0.5% to take our total property taxes up to 2%. And that incremental difference, we use that to pay bonds, and it's called a special tax levy. And the bonds are sized based upon the amount of revenue that special tax will generate. But typically it has to adhere to a 3-to-1 value to lien ratio, very similar to what we talked about in our special assessment bond category. The special tax levies typically can increase at a maximum of 2% per year. But the only reason I mention this is it's another form of bonds that are used quite prevalently and only in the state of California. Hey guys, I think we're gonna cut it off at these questions for today. We're gonna come back next week and we're gonna answer the remaining questions. I hope to see you next week during our next podcast on land to lots. Thank you.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Tune in next week for the next episode.